Good morning. My name is Steve Barden. I'm VP for Strategic Initiatives for Northern California Grant Makers. I'm a Black man wearing big glasses. I have a very gray beard, wearing a blue shirt and a blue jacket and a tie. And we are jamming on a Thursday morning here, day 2 of the conference, and having a discussion about a very important topic, housing for all, and how we can advance a housing for all agenda given the environment and the opportunities that we're in. So welcome to all of you here joining us this morning. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat with your name, pronouns, organization, and the indigenous land you're joining from. Live captions are enabled. You can turn captions on by pressing the CC button at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see that, don't see how to do that, you can connect with Nicole via chat and she can help you out. So this morning's discussion is, as I said, about housing for all and the opportunity we have to leverage the enormous resources coming down the pike for recovery from the pandemic we are still in. But this is a unique climate that has been created by an unfortunate event, by the pandemic, to advance a housing for all agenda. These resources are so incredibly important to getting at the solutions to the housing challenges that we have been experiencing for decades now. And it's not just dollars for projects, but this is an environment where we can move policy solutions and policy that has prevented us in some cases from advancing housing solutions. So we today are blessed with a panel of folks who are actively working in this space and funding in this space and understanding all the vagaries and unique challenges of this issue. So I'm going to start off with our moderator, Con Russo, who will introduce the panel. Con serves as the Vice President of Policy and Innovation and Senior Director for the Partnership for the Bay's Future at the San Francisco Foundation, and is a longtime friend and colleague here. So Con, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you all for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for your leadership and for curating this important conversation. And thank you to the Northern California Grantmakers for bringing us together for this opportunity to learn. As Steve mentioned, my name is Con Russo. My pronouns are he, him. And I'm joining you from Ohlone Land, also known as San Jose, California. I'm wearing a white button-down shirt with a pinstripe navy blue vest, and behind me is a forest of redwoods. I'll be serving as your moderator for our discussion, and this will, what I hope to be a really interactive section. And we encourage you to post your comments and questions throughout the conversation, and we'll address them as we go along. So joining our conversation today are 3 really bold, innovative, and effective leaders, Ruby, Melissa, and Tomiqua, and I'm going to invite them to share more about their expertise in just a little bit. But to help us frame our discussion, I wanted to provide a really high-level overview of what we mean by intersectionality. We recognize that housing is tied to every facet of the lives of our families and communities. It's tied to transportation, it's tied to jobs and education and economic recovery and health, just to name a few. We saw this clearly as we faced COVID. We took steps we once thought were really impossible, or we were told that was impossible, in order to provide homes to those without, when we saw homelessness as a public health issue that impacted us all. We'll share a little bit more I'll share a little bit more detail shortly, but about the state and government resources. But as Steve mentioned, the state and federal government are making some really historic investments in housing. And the pandemic has showed us how starkly the housing crisis is impacting all areas of our lives. And we have a unique opportunity to break down some of the silos in which we have operated to be bold and to be creative in tackling these issues. We hope that our discussion today will help you understand the opportunity at hand and how important it is for you to join us at this moment to help solve our housing crisis. With that, I'm excited to introduce you to our panel of experts: Melissa Jones, the Executive Director of BARHI, Ruby Bularia, the Head of Housing Affordability at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and Tamika Moss, founder and CEO of All Home. Melissa, do you mind if I hand it to you to share a little about yourself and your organization? And maybe
Sure.
address just quickly in your introduction how this infusion of additional resources, such as federal and state funds, has really allowed your organization to take a more intersectional approach.
Sure, happy to. Good morning, everybody. I am Melissa Jones, the Executive Director of Barhi on Ohlone land, and I'm wearing a yellow jacket, have brown curly hair, and a white wall background behind me. It's a pleasure to be here today. It's a pleasure to be in a moment of unprecedented federal investment and a state surplus that is much larger than we expected not too long ago. And I think that that's a huge opportunity for us as a region, as a state of California, and as a country to be thinking about how we invest in the future of health and housing. And so Barhi has been doing housing and health work for a number of years now. We worked about 5 years ago with the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, based on conversations we heard from health departments all across the region, to create a housing affordability and health report that focused on housing stability and family needs all across the Bay Area, really noting the housing cost burdens that we were seeing, not just in our 3 big cities, but actually in every jurisdiction across the region, and started to talk about what are the solutions that can be full regional solutions for housing affordability and health. We then worked staffing for San Francisco Foundation, the Equity Kitchen Cabinet for CASA, which was deeply focused on moving forward a 3 Ps agenda for housing, really at, the solutions focus on the tenant protection, preservation of currently affordable housing, and production of new housing. And we think this particular moment is an important one to drive forward, building on the strong base of the economic interventions we have for low-income families around housing, into also thinking specifically about the experience of Black Americans and Black people across the Bay Area. So, in the Bay Area, housing displacement is big. It's big for everyone. And we see it most pronounced for the Black communities of the Bay. Over the last couple of decades, we've seen a 66% loss of Black population in East Palo Alto, and between 40 and 50% in Berkeley, San Francisco, and Oakland. These are huge numbers. We all feel it even before we see the numbers. And we think this is a unique opportunity to start to direct resources direct to the 2 issues that are driving Black displacement in the Bay. A search for affordable rentals, and a search for affordable homeownership. And so happy to talk more about that later in the process. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Melissa. Ruby, can I hand it over to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, I'm Ruby Laura Schifrin, and I have long Black hair, wearing a white button down, and I'm calling in from Ohlone land, pronounced she, her. And I'm really honored to be here besides Tamika and Melissa, who are both grantee partners of ours as well in this. And we truly believe also in intersectionality and kind of cross-sectional partnership in particular, which is really necessary. We need everyone in to solve our housing and homelessness crisis in California, right? Philanthropy, business, government, labor, nonprofit. Only together will we kind of get through this and have the power necessary to enact those solutions, right? CZI's Housing Affordability Program is dedicated to rebuilding our housing system with racial and economic equity at its core, and with collaboration really as a guiding principle, so that everyone can live, work, and thrive in California. As Melissa mentioned, our work is also anchored in the 3 Ps, and really came from that CASA process too, right? Is that this was something that wasn't invented, behind the scenes. It was a very public process. It was a long process that was necessary to get to consensus around anchoring on this 3 P principle. And so we really want to continue to lift that up and make that kind of a core part of not just our work, but kind of thinking about intersectionality too, and bringing more folks to the table. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ruby. Tamika?
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Tamika Moss, and I'm the founder and CEO of All Home. I am wearing glasses. I have a purple background with a blue shirt and dreadlocks. And I go by she, her pronouns, and am joining you from Ohlone Land. I am so excited to be on this panel with such amazing, courageous women that I get to work with and interact with regularly. All Home has really been designed. I started the organization about 4 years ago now, and really trying to look at that intersectional nature, Con, that you referred to, which is about how do we first address all of our brothers and sisters who are unhoused on our streets every single night in the Bay Area, but not just finding housing for those individuals and families, but how do we actually look more upstream to the more than 1 million households who have extremely low incomes in our communities, folks earning less than $35,000 a year for a household of 4. How do we ensure that those folks have an opportunity to stay housed, to thrive, to raise their families in the Bay Area? And so our work is really centered around both redressing the racial disparities that exist among people who are experiencing homelessness in our region, but also looking both at the housing and the income side of the coin. We think that those two things are inextricably linked, and we think it's really important for us to think about policies that tackle health, that tackle the folks' ability to earn wages and incomes that allow them to afford their housing costs and other basic needs. Over the last year plus, All Home organized a regional table. Ruby spoke to this a moment ago. We know that it is necessary to bring all sectors to the table. So we created this group called the Regional Impact Council, really to help the region come together. We work across the 9-county Bay Area, business leaders, folks with lived experiences, our CBO partners, everyone in our ecosystem who touches this issue to come up with strategies that we could agree on to drive a significant reduction in unsheltered homelessness while also providing permanent housing solutions and preventing homelessness where possible. So we have been organizing ourselves over the last year and have been implementing our regional action plan with an audacious goal of reducing unsheltered homelessness by 75% over the next 3 years. So I'm really excited to dig into some of these topics because a housing for all agenda means truly that everyone in our community has a place to call home. And homes for people experiencing homelessness don't look any different than those who have higher incomes. And so I'm really excited to talk about the continuum of housing that we need.
Thank you, Tamika, Melissa, and Ruby. I'm excited to delve into this more deeply with you. As you all just kind of inferred, this is a unique time and that there are resources that is available to us at this time that we have never seen in the past, right? So to date, California will have received almost more than $100 billion in federal and state investments from the American Rescue Plan Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure, and included in that is a potential $45.7 billion surplus from the California budget alone. On March 28th, the Biden administration proposed one of the largest housing and urban development budgets in decades by requesting a $6.2 billion increase over current spending levels. And proposed increases includes an 11% boost, which is about $3.6 billion for homeless assistance grants, and the expansion of rental vouchers to over 200,000 more households. One of the things that we know is a vast majority of these allocations are expected just to be one-time investments. So that puts a lot of pressure on us to kind of think about how we can be creative about using these funds in a way that is transformative to the system. One other note is that, particularly on intersectionality, the state has also launched the Community Economic Resilience Fund. And this is a $600 million fund available to promote sustainable and equitable recovery from the economic impact of this pandemic. So with all of that infusion What do you see as the opportunities and policy windows that this funding is creating? Particularly because, again, we will probably not see this type of infusion of funding again in our lifetimes. I want to open that to all the panelists. If there's any.
I'm happy to start because I'm sure Tamika and Melissa will have a lot more to say on this. I think one thing I just want to double down on what you said, Khan, is that this is one-time infusions, right? So we have lost our permanent revenue sources for housing and homelessness, and it is still not, our spending annually is still not near what we used to spend on this. And so I just want to put that into perspective, not to say that this influx of money is important and needed and amazing, but just that hopefully part of the advocacy efforts is how do we leverage this for ongoing support to show, look at what we can do with this, imagine what we could do with an ongoing revenue permanent source of financing. But like I said, with that being said, this influx of resources has been incredible. I think in particular from a funder perspective, it's really created an incentive to collaborate and align more deeply across sectors. And so philanthropy is coming together to think about how can we leverage our resources to maximize the impact of these federal dollars. And I think also one challenge of that or kind of opportunity is thinking about multi-sectional issues too. It's actually really hard as a funder to fund multi-sector kind of collaboratives, right? We know that housing is super intersectional with climate change, with healthcare, with criminal justice, right? With all of these issues. Yet, you know, as funders, when we get together, we talk about like mission creep or like, oh, this feels like out of scope or, you know, so it actually created an opportunity to think more about how can we fund collaborations that look at economic mobility, housing, poverty reduction, criminal justice reform, kind of in this more collective manner, which I hope we can hold on to, because I think that that is so critical and helping to create that infrastructure that's needed for the long term, because it's really hard to build in a crisis, right? And luckily in California, we actually do have, compared to other states, a lot of capacity. And a lot of times where it almost feels like start and stops whenever these crises happen, like we build up some infrastructure and then the funding dries up, the groups kind of fall apart, right? Like, so we kind of lose that again. Or there's the kind of skeleton of it, depending on who's left in the field from the last time. And so I wonder actually also, how can we use this opportunity to both collaborate, build that infrastructure that then lasts? And so we're also working during the off season, so to speak, right, in between crises, so that we can respond more equitably when they do happen.
I was going to say, I absolutely agree. And the issue, so we are the coalition of the health departments. We work a lot with public agencies, and that issue of one-time money is a really tricky one to figure out. How do you take the best advantage of one-time money and build something in? And I think one of the ways to do that is, instead of thinking, often, you know, a government agency will think about buying a service or buying a particular, investing in a particular kind of service. I think this is a really interesting time to think about capitalizing our infrastructure, in particular our community infrastructure, and how we work and engage with communities. And so, for example, there are a number of organizations across the region that have been delivering services. I think we've seen during COVID, really been able to reach community members with accurate information about COVID, reach community members who needed food access, who needed access to legal services, housing services, eviction prevention services, a whole range of things. And they've been able to do that through a lot of the support of philanthropy. And I think this is a really interesting time for philanthropy to partner with government to be doing investments that help them expand and deliver more in this moment for recovery, so that we don't have such an uneven recovery as we did in 2008, where communities of color continue to feel the tailwind effects in housing of having of the fallout of the 2008 recession and downturn. And then for philanthropy to work alongside that to help organizations think about what their business models are moving forward that might be unique or different, and help them capture and access resources differently along the way. There are a couple of great examples. So for example, in California, CalAIM is changing what's reimbursable over time through Medicaid, through Medi-Cal. And so helping organizations figure out what their long-term strategy is, what they can deliver and learn from and with this one-time money, and what their long-term strategy is might be to deliver things over the long term with these funding sources such as CalAIM. And so I think that's a great opportunity. I think the other thing is this is the opportunity to invest in particular in BIPOC-led infrastructure, which we saw how important it was during the course of the pandemic. And so one of the things Barhai did was bring together Black-led organizations from across the region to talk about solutions around housing. We had started with coffees that was much more informal, much a conversation about what have we seen from all of our different vantage points, from the different range and experiences that we have as Black people in the Bay. And then what does that mean for how we can take this moment of unprecedented investment and stop the wave of displacement and ensure we have investment in communities that tend to see less philanthropic investment, like East Contra Costa and Solano counties, one of the only places in the region where the Black communities are growing. We think that's a really important investment nexus because it's both a housing investment and it addresses the 10-year difference in life expectancy experienced by African Americans across this region. And so I think we've put together a list of all the currently fundable housing and other kinds of economic interventions run by Black-led organizations and developers. We've shared it with elected officials across the region, and we've put together a state request that's moving forward now. That's a Black Hat housing funding pool that does the full circle and cycle of development that we think is really important, right? Community planning, community capacity building, and project development, being able to do brick and mortar work all in one way. So you don't need to plan and raise expectations and then hope you find the money, but instead have that full circle available as planning. And so we think those kinds of creative solutions, organized together with community partners and government, thinking together about what's next, is really what's going to make the best use of this moment.
Thank you, Melissa.
Yeah, so much has already been said. I guess I would just add a little finer point on the fact that, prior to this administration and prior to the Biden-Harris administration and prior to the pandemic, the federal government had actually gotten out of the business of supporting housing across this nation. And you can see the correlation between those disinvestments with the increase in homelessness and housing insecurity across the country. And so it is incredibly heartening to see not only the Biden-Harris administration investing in HUD in unprecedented ways, as well as this influx of funding to respond to the pandemic and trying to support an equitable recovery. But I guess I would argue that prior to the pandemic, we also already had communities in crisis that were starved of resources in terms of not being able to have access to livable wages, not being able to cover their rents because the cost of housing was so expensive. And so I think Ruby said it, right? Crises create an opportunity and a window. And I wonder if there's a way in our advocacy and policy changes to not only fight for permanent sources, but to recognize that the resources that flooded into communities through the pandemic was to stabilize folks who weren't yet in crisis, right? We had a public health emergency, and the resources that came for rental assistance was to try to keep folks in their homes before they became homeless. It was to try to prevent, sickness and death for folks who were exposed to COVID. And so all of those resources are what is needed to stabilize and bring 161,000 Californians into housing, to ensure that people who are just on the brink of a housing emergency can stay housed. So I think it's just having some perspective about what it actually takes. These price tags are big. Folks are intimidated by the large numbers. But I also think if we had been investing at levels and at scale based on the needs, we wouldn't have these incredible traumatic crises in our communities around housing insecurity and homelessness. And so I think if we can reframe that to recognize that resources are what we need, We need alignment and coordination and accountability to ensure that those resources are actually getting the outcomes that we need. Those are the opportunities that I'm most excited about, with the federal government getting back into the game and all levels of government, philanthropy, and others really trying to leverage those resources as they currently are one-time resources.
Thank you for all of your responses. You know, as I'm listening to what you're saying, I wanted to kind of maybe focus on a couple of themes that I've heard, right? Ruby, you mentioned that, you know, the best time to respond to a crisis is not during a crisis, right? It's like, what is the infrastructure? What is it that we need to be doing in between crises to create that stability? And I'm going to push all of you to maybe focus on this a little bit more about the Build Back Better theme, right? What is it something that you think we can use the recovery funds to fix or change? Can you share like an example from a county example, a city or nonprofit example that you think is building back better? You know, Melissa, you mentioned a little bit of that with the reimbursements of Medi-Cal. But what are other examples that really exemplifies the possibility or power of this moment to build back better? What is it that we've named that is broken and that this moment can help fix or change?
Well, I think this is a moment to really be creating the models of how we build our recoveries. So we are dealing with a COVID recovery now, and every year we deal with climate-related disasters and the recoveries that come with them. And particularly in our North Bay counties, that's been exceptionally true. And so I think that this is a moment where we can start to have really deep planning with community around how we allocate in recovery. And how we think about the communities most impacted and hear from them and design around their needs. And I think that that model is great, not just for emergency and recovery, but then in general for how we think about the repair of the systemic racism we've seen over time, so that we don't have the big gaps we see in health outcomes, in education outcomes, in a whole range of outcomes, income outcomes. You know, during the pandemic, the emergency operations centers get stood up often by a sheriff's department or by an emergency management department. And often there's not a staff person whose job it is explicitly to focus on racial equity, for example, in response. But we know from COVID that racial disparities were a huge issue in COVID outcomes, and that they were improved when we had targeted responses. One of the things that Barhi did at the time was to scan the country for who had equity officers assigned specifically in their emergency response with budget authority and the authority to direct staff on response, and wrote up for the region and for the state some models that could assign equity response in every equity operations center. That model got picked up by nearly every Bay Area county, and then the state of California took the model and picked it up and required it as part of their grant making for the rolling recovery. That now means we have 47 equity officers across the state whose job it is to focus on disparities in racial equity and response. Now, with ARPA coming forward, there's a real opportunity to have those equity officers and the relationships they built with community in response and hearing from community needs. They did things like design specific interventions for farm workers, so that to drive down what were really high rates at the time. They were able to look at disproportionate Black death rates and isolate them to particular skilled nursing facilities and then address them. And then in the recovery in places like Sonoma County, they were able to use the networks that they had built, the community task forces, to start to talk about how ARPA money should be awarded. I think that's a great model for thinking about how we award infrastructure dollars too. And so I think really creating a runway for people to know what money is out there. I think San Francisco Foundation has done some great work around that in their recovery process and sharing data and information and access to lobbyist details to help understand what's coming and help communities prepare for it. And then to have community-based, that information flow to community-based networks, design strategies, and then set interventions could be really powerful. It would be wonderful to leave this process with a way that we automate equity in our responses.
Thank you, Melissa. Ruby, Tamika, would you like to respond to that question also?
Sure. So I think some examples that people often point to right now are like HomeKey, right? The movement that the government did in order to acquire hotels and convert them for permanent housing for unsheltered folks, and just the speed, I think, through which they were able to do that. Not just that kind of innovation, but the speed is something that I want to lift up. They were able to, I think there's 39 approved sites now, which would create over 2,400 units of housing. Tamika might know the numbers better on that. The FIP program, which is the Foreclosure Intervention Fund, it's $500 million allocated that will go towards the acquisition and rehab of 1 to 25 unit buildings. And specifically, community land trusts were instrumental in advocating for that set aside and for the rules around it so that they can access and tap into that money. So those are kind of two programs I would highlight. But in terms of like themes of this Build Back Better, I think the idea of cutting the red tape and thinking about how we can streamline things that actually work better for people and their outcomes. We're so obsessed with fraud prevention and like measuring someone's worthiness versus how are we making programs universal and saying, everyone deserves housing, everyone deserves this. With the ERAF program, the Emergency Rental Assistance Fund, part of the reason why we're able to get that money out quickly is because there wasn't a million checks on stuff. And maybe there will be fraud, but like, let's just consider that a sunk cost. Like, why are we so worried about the 10% of fraud when we're helping 90% of people? And so that mindset shift, I thought was really great during the pandemic that I hope that we can continue into like more performance-based outcomes versus prescriptive process.
Being a recovering bureaucrat myself, I 100% agree with you. I think sometimes we forget to center people versus processes. Tamika?
I think it's been said. I mean, I too spent a bit of my career in the public sector. And one of the things that we saw that was most effective in this time was how quickly resources were able to be distributed to actual people, not through systems, but people were able to get rental assistance in their hands in a matter of weeks because we set up an infrastructure that allowed them to do that. And as complicated as it all was, as many, challenges that there were in order to get that system off the ground, the state was able to pull it off in partnership with many local or counties, cities and counties across the region. We also All Homes stood up a regional homelessness prevention network that allowed those resources to be distributed locally. Those are the kinds of innovations that need to be made permanent. We also saw a CEQA exemption that accelerated projects moving through the capital and financing process for HomeKey. Those kinds of things need to be made permanent. We should not talk about a crisis and then treat our strategies as if they're long-term. We should act with urgency. We should make it as easy and simple as possible for people to get into the right housing that they need, with the resources for the operators to actually operate the housing. We saw a lot of resources for capital, building new homes, but we also need to be able to operate those buildings and provide that support to tenants long-term. And those two things should be done together so that you don't have to piecemeal your solutions when you know that's exactly the set of solutions that are working. So that's the only thing I would add. I think acting with urgency and creating as streamlined of systems as we can so that in fact people aren't being like, all this money is going toward these activities, and yet here I am still vulnerable and waiting for my opportunity. So we need to translate the intent and those resources to actually be distributed into communities much more efficiently.
Great, thank you. Again, I'm going to encourage those who are joining us to share your comments and thoughts in the chat. I wanted to lift up an aspirational idea that's in the chat and wanted to see maybe Melissa, what you thought about this, because this seems to be the intersection of health and housing. Karen Grove asks, can CalAIM reimburse for housing costs in situations where someone is at risk of losing their house? that clearly could be preventative healthcare. What do you think about this idea, Melissa? Is this something that has been discussed before? Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a really powerful idea and it has been discussed before. And now, as part of the next wave of CalAIM changes, the cost of housing navigator services are reimbursable by CalAIM. So the sort of service side of housing. There's been a long discussion and a lot of advocacy to also have housing itself or emergency vouchers also be included. I can't tell you where that has landed right now. I know that it's been a hard conversation and maybe Tamika knows, but I think that has not landed quite as favorably.
Thank you, Melissa. So as you know, our conversation today is part of the Northern California Grantmakers Conference. So I'm going to bring philanthropy into the question. As you're talking about these opportunities, and where do you think philanthropy can play, or how do we need philanthropy to show up or show up differently to support the moment?
I can start on that. I think that there's two main things that I would say would be good. One is convening power. We talk a lot about this, but being clear on what that means. Sometimes that doesn't mean philanthropy being the convener, right? It means identifying the right anchor partners to give them the resources that they need to convene effectively. Because it's really hard when you're, I look at these two folks on the call with me today who I consider kind of like conveners, right? They're regional actors that work with multiple other organizations. And in order to do that effectively, they need the resources and capacity to do so, right? So that they're not stretching their time between a bunch of things. So I think that is really important. So thinking about how convening shows up in convening power. The second way I would say is flexible, risk tolerant capital. Philanthropy is technically drops in the bucket compared to the need and what government sector and private sector can do. And so how can our capital be the catalytic, risk embracing capital that gets other investors in, especially ones that are not the likely actors? And I think about Partnership for the Bay's Future, which Con, used to be the director of, as a good example of that, where we put in 40 million first loss capital, and we're able to raise 500 million for an investment fund for the 5-county Bay Area, and about 25 million, maybe Con might correct me on that number, for the policy fund, which is money awarded to jurisdictions to implement a protection, preservation, production type policy. And it's done in collaboration with a local CBO partner. So it's very much a public-private partnership where, again, kind of embraces this idea of collaboration, but it will not be possible if we do not take that first step. And I see so much, and this is a pervasive problem with philanthropy, right? It's like we're giving out free money, yet we're probably diligencing it more than like you would if it was, a for-profit company, that, or like a venture kind of mindset, right? Where you're like, I'm going to make 10 bets and hopefully one wins. And so I try to think a little bit to that extent of like, what are the hoops we're making folks jump into versus let's just try some stuff. And yes, we're going to fail, but if we're winning every time, we're not doing our job, because we need to be able to be that kind of R&D dollars. So you're going to fail. If you don't, then you're not being bold enough.
Yeah, I really like that, Ruby. When I was at the Cisco Foundation, my boss always says, Con, all of your grant reports are coming back, successful. That means you're not taking enough risk, right? And we are in a space that we can take that risk. I think one of the things that I learned supporting the Partnership for the Bay's Future is that, because there is flexible capital that can take risk, we can be much more responsive and creative in the products that we create also, right? We learned that there was no money for rehabilitation of homes, so we were able to create a product for that. And I think I would kind of double down on that level of flexibility and risk for the sector. Melissa?
Yeah. So I'm going to make some suggestions that are particular to this moment. I wouldn't always say this the need, but in this particular moment, I think there's a lot of help needed to stick the details. And so what I mean by that is there's an unprecedented amount of money flowing. There's a lot out there that you can read about in the paper that community organizations are following and watching, some have advocated for, but the details on how to access the money is evading many, many people. It's not clear. And so I think in many organizations and community. So I think as much as foundations can do the kind of work that I think we saw San Francisco Foundation do around, these are the funding streams that are coming out. This is what's still in discussion and can be impacted. This is what's already flowing. This is who it will flow to and where the decision makers are. That kind of really detailed information is going to be the difference between community-based organizations seeing resources in recovery and not. And so I think that's a really important piece right now. I think the other thing is to help us grow the pie. And so need is spreading across our region. It's not all in the same places that it was, but it hasn't really left anywhere either. And so we need a strategy that grows the pie. Foundations can use their voice in such powerful ways to be a second to and support and Me Too to the many community organizations that have banded together in coalition and called out strategies to solve problems. And so I think as much as your foundation can do that, it's really, really powerful. And then the other pieces, the pandemic emergency response is over, but the press on organizations is still extremely strong. The amount of resources that's flowing, the pace at which it's flowing, the amount of things there are to figure out. As much as your grant making processes can be supporting people to do that, minimizing paperwork while maintaining enough continuity that for what you need and for what organizations need, I think this is a really important time for that. Throughout the pandemic, we've had funders call us and say, what do you think needs to happen now? What are the ways we can structure our grant to make that happen? We think those kinds of things that are fast partnerships that help really move things quickly is what's going to be needed to get us to an equitable recovery. There's still a lot of people teetering on the edge around their housing stability and teetering on the edge with their income. And so we still have a whole lot of work to do.
Yeah, right on. I mean, I guess I would just add a couple of things. The first is we saw a really incredible opportunity for philanthropy and the nonprofit organizations to band together around homelessness prevention. It's an interesting thing that it is much more cost effective to prevent someone from falling into homelessness than it is once they've lost their home to rehouse them. And it was a really incredible partnership that All Home was able to do with some of our individual donors and philanthropy to put private resources into a homelessness prevention fund that then allowed, when the emergency rental assistance dollars that came in through the feds, people were actually able to get more money. So prevention is something that is still not yet institutional in the public sector. And it's a really great way for flexible philanthropic and private funds to literally give folks financial assistance, legal assistance, and case management services to stay housed. So that's a very specific example of how we've seen philanthropic dollars leveraged, given that the sort of the field of prevention is still new and how government needs to fund that. So I think, again, all of these dollars allow for a catalytic public investment once we have proof of concept and we're able to do some of these pilots that we've been able to run. I think the other piece that's important for philanthropy is we have a chance to actually fund things that work. You know, like, yes, we want risk capital, but there are actually ways in which you can get super granular. Black folks experiencing homelessness across this region is unprecedented. The lack of Black prosperity that Melissa's been talking about since the top of the hour is not a new issue. And we hear a lot of limitations from government about how you can't do racially specific funding, how there's all these barriers and fair housing laws that we have to consider. But what we've been able to see is philanthropy sort of step up and say, you know what, we're going to put our resources where it matters most. We're going to target populations, target issues where we can be innovative and creative and strategic and do some proof of concept work that then gives government more flexibility to put public dollars into those types of efforts. And so I just encourage philanthropy to keep doing what you're doing. Look at multi-year funding, because many of us are doing the work. And as Melissa said, it's going to need to be done for quite some time to create the sustainable infrastructure for our communities to truly recover. And investing in evidence-based, outcome-driven efforts is really how we're going to get there.
Nika, you're talking about proof of concept, right, as a way for others to join in investment. Ruby, I know that CZI has been involved in really building out the ADU infrastructure, the accessory dwelling unit infrastructure. Can you maybe speak a little bit to that project that you're working on and how it might serve as a model for our region and our sector?
Yeah, sure. And this relates to kind of what Tamika was saying around we need a philanthropy also to invest in pilots. So we actually started within the ADU space on the advocacy side, supporting advocates at the state level to legalize essentially ADUs, which are accessory dwelling units or backyard flats. They can be both attached to the home and also detached. Granny flats, right? People have different names for it. I think there's a huge informal market for this, especially if you're in places like LA or other suburban communities where you've kind of seen this a lot. So those were mostly illegal. And if caught by the city would charge you a really hefty fine for that, or make you do upgrades and all of this stuff. So anyway, passing a bunch of legislation to legalize it. And then once it's legalized, you create the enabling conditions to actually do it. But okay, how do we do this equitably? And right now, Turner Center has done some reports on this, but most of the people who on the data that we have build these units do it through their high kind of income or a HELOC, which is like a second mortgage on your home. So you have to have enough equity in your home to pull out to be able to build one of these. And so the way that they're getting distributed is maybe not as equitable as it could be. And we see this both as a wealth building opportunity for homeowners and also as a way to provide more below naturally occurring affordable housing, right? Because these units tend to rent out naturally below market. And so we partnered with the city of Oakland, and we chose Oakland for a couple of reasons. One is that they already did a needs assessment for their area to be able to identify how many parcels that they had that could accommodate new ADUs. They also focused a lot on the conversion of existing ones and legalizing them and thinking about the equity implications there. And we also wanted this to be an anti-displacement measure for the Black community in Oakland. And so thinking about a lot of Black homeowners that exist there, and I'm sure some folks have seen, but I've been more recently attuned to kind of the phenomenon of aging into homelessness, which also disproportionately affects Black and brown communities. So folks who have been homeowners, and then all of a sudden they lose their home at age 70 or something. It's really, I don't know, it hits home for me. And so having this as an additional source of income could be a great stabilizer. So we partnered with City of Oakland, Richmond Housing Neighborhood Services, who is the project manager of this, Nikki Beasley, who's amazing, and Self-Help Enterprise, which is the credit union that's doing the lending. So CZI provided a $2 million guarantee. San Francisco Foundation is also collaborating with us on this. $2 million guarantee to support self-help in creating a new financial product to lend to folks that don't have enough equity in their home or don't have enough income to support the loan. And so our guarantee acts as a backstop. And the idea here is that it's kind of twofold. One is about the financial components here, right? How do we get our financial markets to respond better to serving a wider community, right? And by targeting Black homeowners, that's that whole curb cut effect, right? We're thinking this serves all homeowners in Oakland, but we really built it with Black homeowners in mind and did focus groups with Black homeowners to design the ADUs, all of that kind of stuff. So hopefully this financial product can get scaled by government and private sector. And at the same time, we're asking owners to be developers, and that doesn't always work, right? And so having a project manager like Richmond Neighborhood Housing Services there to kind of handhold you through that process and streamline permits and think about on the government side how this can be as over the counter as possible. That model then can be replicated and scaled, frankly, throughout the country, because there's a lot of growing interest in ADUs generally. But yeah, I think it's both kind of this wealth building play as well as kind of affordable housing supply play.
Thank you, Ruby. One of the key themes that we've been talking about today has really been about the, systemic, the impact of, systemic and institutional racism. And one of the key levers for helping to address that is policy. So I wanted to kind of shift our conversation a little bit and get your thoughts about, how do we create the right environment for adopting the policies that we need to be successful and to correct for some of the racism that's already built into our system. Dwayne mentioned during his keynote yesterday that, if we keep on investing in systems that are already broken, it's just going to continue to perpetuate the disparity. So what is it that we can do? How can we create the right environment for adopting the policies to really change the systems? Tamika, do you mind if I start with you?
No, it's such a great question, and I agree with Dwayne. You can't just put good stuff into bad plumbing and expect better outcomes. I think that the acknowledgement first and foremost that systemic racism was at play to create some of the disparities that exist across all of these systems that we've been talking about this hour, but that remain barriers for communities of color to actually attain prosperity in the region. And so I still feel like it's an optional point for some people. Like, how does it really affect whether or not somebody is homeless today? But when you look at the data, every single community in the Bay Area, and I would venture to say in the state, has a disproportionate amount of Black and Brown people who are experiencing homelessness or a housing crisis across this region. And that is not accidental. So we have to acknowledge that this is in fact what happened. The state sanctioned racial policies around housing and wealth building and the lack of opportunity that persists are directly related. And so I think once we can all sort of agree on that, then we can figure out what to do about it. You have to actually be able to know how certain policies are affecting certain people. And if we are not disaggregating our data, when we're looking at housing outcomes, when we look at who goes through the homelessness response system, who gets access to loans, as Ruby's been talking about, who gets access to capital, and Melissa is doing this with some very strategic efforts around Black folks being housed. But the fact of the matter is, you don't know what you don't know. And if you don't measure it, you can't fix it. And so one of the things that we're doing is we're running a bill, AB 2094, that is calling out extremely low income housing in our regional housing needs allocation report. You'd think that that was actually a category that we were tracking to see how many of those units are we building through our housing elements and other efforts to actually make sure that people who are just poor in our region, they're not afflicted, they're not doing anything wrong, they do not have the incomes to meet the burden of housing in our communities. We are running a bill to ensure that that particular category is tracked. So those are the kinds of things that you have to do. You have to actually recognize our programs and services culturally responsive to the people who need them. Not everybody who is experiencing homelessness needs permanent supportive housing or the highest service enriched housing where you need a permanent subsidy for the rest of your life and you need wraparound services. Of 2/3 of folks experiencing homelessness across the region, the 9-county Bay Area, need a deeply affordable place to live. They don't need permanent supportive housing. They might need a little bit of case management to get back on their feet, but 50% of those households are working and they are still experiencing homelessness. So I guess I would just say the systemic racial implications are still persistent, and you don't fix them if you're not focused on where do they still exist, how are they affecting communities directly, and how do we adjust our policies and responses in real time, right? Like there are systems across the region, I'll use Alameda County, for example, before I turn it over to Melissa, that recognize that there were racial disparities still persisting in their homelessness response system. So they actually, in real time, brought folks together to be like, what are we doing wrong in terms of providing housing exits and in terms of providing other services that were disproportionately impacting communities of color? Those are the kinds of things that you have to do. You have to stay on it if you're going to make a real difference around the persistence of systemic racism in our systems.
Yeah, thank you, Tamika. I think Tamika and I think very similarly about the need to stay on things, stick the details, look at the outcomes, and really keep figuring out what will get us to the goal. And I think one of the things that foundations need to think about and us as organizations need to think about is when what is going to get us to the goal is at the intersection, as Ruby said, of multiple approaches. And so we could easily say that what gets us to the housing goal is only a particular kind of building or a particular kind of units or a particular way of approaching it. But I think actually what we know now, having been through it, is there's a piece that's about the tenant protections, there's a piece that's about preservation, there's a piece that's about producing enough housing at the range of incomes that we need in this deeply expensive area. There's also a piece about it that there's other things that need to knit together because that on its own hasn't closed our racial disparities gaps, right? And so we've really been in this place of saying, what are the policy solutions that get us to closing the gap, in particular for the African-American community, because of the burden that's been experienced so long over time, and that is showing up in what I always consider to be the most unjust way a disparity and a legacy of oppression can show up, which is a difference in life expectancy, right? This idea that we could know for decades that there's a decade-long difference in life expectancy and not consider it a primary goal of our public systems to repair that, or to take on policies that only repair the injustice moving forward, but don't look back and bring us up to where we should be. And so I think that that's the other question for policy right now. And it's an interesting place, I think, for philanthropy to start to weigh in. Right, because there's a big conversation raging in California about repair. There's a big conversation raging about what is the scale of what we need to get to solutions. I think philanthropy really helping with narrative that helps people understand there are a whole range of solutions that we can move forward that hadn't existed prior, and then we've taken on as a nation to get to the scale that we need. Housing is one of them, right? Having HUD really reinvest deeply in housing. The other model I'll share is it's the Ryan White CARES Act. It used to be across the country, if you didn't live in a city with really major philanthropy, you didn't have services for HIV/AIDS, and you didn't have prevention services. And there was a national movement across the country that created a baseline of foundational infrastructure all across this country for there to be a set of services. There's money, resources that flow to the state, to localities, and to nonprofit organizations to create a wraparound set of infrastructure to address and prevent HIV/AIDS. We have these moments as a country, as a state, where we make a decision to say, this is an issue that's so important that we're going to build the infrastructure we need, and then we're going to keep delivering it. And I think that that's the kind of policy moment that we're in that we should be thinking about, and that we should be applying our resources to.
Melissa, I really appreciate you bringing up narrative and stories and changing hearts and minds as a part of this. Before I get to that, though, I wonder if anyone has a thought about, big bets that we should be pursuing the next couple of years. What are the big policy strategies and opportunities that you see coming up?
Yeah, maybe I'll start, Khan. I would just lift up the Bay Area Housing and Financing Authority that was created a couple of years ago by then Assemblymember David Chu and his incredible leadership to really figure out how do we bring a regional approach to addressing our housing crisis across the Bay Area. And this financing authority lives within our transportation infrastructure, MTC and ABAG. And what's so hopeful to me about this financing agency is that it's talking about what Melissa was just saying. We need infrastructure that allows us to build at scale the type of investments across the 3 Ps that we need to actually not just meet the need right now, but meet the needs of folks who have been waiting for support for decades in our region. And being able to aggregate resources, think collectively about, we're looking to do a housing bond in the next couple of years to finance this authority, to ensure that localities have resources to build more affordable homes, that we can invest in homelessness prevention, that we can keep tenants in their homes, right? That's the kind of big move, right? That long-term sustainable infrastructure in creating a coordinated set of strategies that are going to help our region meet the needs. And no one city can do it alone. I mean, I think that's very clear. No one county can do it alone. And frankly, that's why when we were talking earlier about the federal government, all levels of government need to be on board. Just like philanthropy, the private sector, our community-based organizations. This is a societal challenge. And if we keep segmenting it as if it's somebody else's responsibility, then our whole society, it wins when we have addressed our homelessness and housing crisis. And I think if everybody saw themselves in that victory, then we all do what we do. We bring our individual assets to the table and we figure out how to sustain those assets over time.
Good, thank you for that. I think I'm particularly excited about the possibility of BAFA because we're talking about tens of $billions to our region, right? Up to $20 billion. So I hope others continue to learn about this effort and see how you might be able to engage with it. Ruby, I'm going to turn to you a little bit, right? Like to pass these large housing efforts at scale, to pass these public policy efforts, we have to change hearts and minds. I think all of us know how important housing is, but we don't also always express that at the poll. Can you talk about maybe some of CCI's efforts to address that?
Yeah, and I'm going to pull in a little bit what Tamika was saying too, because I think of that saying, luck is when opportunity meets preparation. I think you can probably say success is when opportunity meets preparation too, because when we think about what our big bets are, the only way to be able to take advantage of a big bet is if we invest in the infrastructure today, right? And so because then those opportunities come, and I've seen this both, when I was more in the field and also now as a funder, that those opportunities come and then you're like, okay, great, who's going to do it? Or like, who's going to put this on the ballot? Or, okay, who's going to lead this? And there isn't that there, or, there's not a unified vision. And so I think that's why the kind of general operating dollars now to organizations sets us up for that 2024 win. And you don't have to be a C4 funder. Infrastructure is C3 dollars, right? Give folks the capacity that they need to be able to think about that kind of more C4 work. And when I say C4, it's 501c4. And so to that effect, narrative change, what Melissa brought up, is something that we are leaning into heavily. And I think we want to center, obviously, it being useful for the field, any research that we do. So it's always both data informed and advocacy informed. And so the idea being is that we convened, it's been 2 years in the making now, convened a roundtable of housing advocates from across the state who represent regional geography, regional diversity, as well as difference in kind of the 3P, right? Some groups, a lot of groups are like, yes, I believe in the 3Ps, but I'm really focused on protection, right? Or yes, I believe in the 3Ps, but I'm really focused on production. Great, let's get all of those folks to be involved in this so that we can truly have something that works for everybody. And we segmented the voter population into different groups based on their values, and then are doing message testing to see what works to move them. A toolkit is forthcoming. This is very iterative though. And so what's unique about CZI is that we have an internal research team that can do this kind of very expensive, big lift kind of research stuff. And then workshop it with the field, right? Like do regional tests. How is this working compared to your existing messaging? What works better? Are we moving towards a shared vision, or are we bifurcating the field? And I say that because, you know, this resonated with me around, you know, we've seen this in other issue areas too, whether it's climate change. You know, one of my colleagues used to work at Planned Parenthood and said they had a big strategy revision because they used to say, you know, abortion should be rare. You know, it was a few things, but rare was this thing that they were like, it was kind of invoking this idea that it was a shameful thing. And so they kind of changed their messaging on that. For housing, it felt like, you know, we were talking a lot about teacher housing, but it's like, okay, what if I'm not a teacher? Do I not deserve housing? So, you know, tying that a little bit to your profession could be problematic in the long term, even if it gets you those short-term wins. So the goal of this work is, how do we get to that housing as a human right, long-term vision? How do we move people to believe that? Because the reality is people don't today. And in California, which is a more progressive state, folks do not necessarily believe that everybody deserves, like they believe everyone deserves housing, but it's like some folks need to earn it, or, you know, you need to, it's a very, and it's not broken down by party lines, right? It's not a Democrat Republican thing. There's plenty of Democrats who don't want housing in their area. And so anyway, so it's a work in progress, but I think one of the things that we're really looking forward to is working with other philanthropies. And I think what Melissa was saying before about expanding the pie is so necessary, because we're kind of tapping on the same funders for all of the funding for this stuff. And we need new funders in this space, especially there's a lot of funders in homelessness that are just now starting to kind of look more upstream at like housing solutions. And, you know, I'll take culpability too, is that, you know, I was looking only at housing and not so much at homelessness. And so I think us also combining our efforts and thinking about housing and homelessness as one thing will be really helpful in getting things like this narrative play to scale.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Ruby. You know, from the San Francisco Foundation, we've really been proud to be a partner with you to kind of advance that work, particularly regionally. You know, we've been working with nonprofit housing to lead an effort called Shift the Bay to really provide tested messages that we know, at least in the Bay Area, has worked well. I can't believe it's already 11:10 and we only have 5 minutes left. I can't tell you how much I've appreciated, been inspired by the conversation today. I've been taking copious notes and making sure that I implement this in the work that we're doing at the San Francisco Foundation. So first I want to give a lot of gratitude and appreciation for the three of you for sharing your expertise with us as the sector. We look to you as our leaders and our thought partners, and offer each of you an opportunity to maybe close this out with final thoughts. Really, you know, would love for you to share something that you're proud of or something that you really want to celebrate as we close out our conversation today. I also want to acknowledge that there were a couple of comments in the chat that we weren't able to lift up, and we'll make sure to get back to you and address those after the session.
Great. I'm happy to start. I want to just drive home a point that Ruby just made. I think this idea of the general operating support giving room to think about what the next phase of strategy should be is a really important one. And so CZI does that really well. They did that with us. It gave us the resources to hire a program manager to help us think about Black health issues. And it brought us ultimately to where we are today, which is to have, and we didn't know this is where it would head, but this is a solution we found would really be the big solution, the big bet, which is to have, we now have a budget request before the state of California called Black Hat. It's focused on the development of a Black housing fund for the Bay Area that does the full circle of development and really creates the next set of planning and thinking and economic investment in the Black Bay Area. We think it's an important and incredible strategy, and it was made possible by that kind of flexible funding that gave us room to think. And so I think that as much as you can do that for your grantees, it's just such a powerful thing. For folks who are interested in that, I'm happy to talk to you more about it. It's supported by the San Francisco Foundation, Fred Blackwell, a whole series of elected officials all across the Bay Area. And we're really grateful for that, and was founded by a set of 40 Black-led organizations with deep and long roots serving Black communities in the Bay.
I, first of all, just thank you, Con, for your brilliance and expertise, both in moderating this panel and all the work that you've done over your career in this space. Ladies, always a pleasure to be with you. My final thoughts are pretty simple. For one, I feel like if we want to have the progressive ideals that this state, this region promises, we have to address together our housing affordability crisis and our challenges around homelessness. And what I want folks to leave with is that these issues are solvable. We actually have evidence-based strategies that work. There are a tremendous amount of folks in the field working every day to house people, to support them on their economic prosperity journeys, to provide opportunities. So it's not that we don't have the answers. I think our society is frustrated. We hear all the time that folks wonder why the problems are getting worse. We are putting all these resources into this issue. What's going wrong? The fact of the matter is, what we've been talking about this whole hour is that we have disinvested in supporting community members who are at risk, on the brink of a housing emergency for decades. And so it is manifesting in real time. In my opinion, homelessness in California is a manifestation of poverty. And we need to really think about what are the anti-poverty levers we need to be pulling in order to address this crisis. It's not about the person's individual conditions. We must look at this systemically. And from one of my favorite people in this work, Amanda Ndiri, often says housing justice is racial justice. If we care about Black and Brown communities across this region, we have to see those things as related and figure out how do we amplify and scale our outcomes. And I am hopeful because I get to work with folks like you all every day who are committed and not deterred by how difficult it is. But we all have to believe that it's possible, or we won't ever get there.
Yeah, well said, Tamika. I'm really excited at this. So we've been at this for 4 years now, and I feel like now we're really starting to see some amazing things happen in this space. And I'm so excited about the phenomenal leaders statewide. Like Tamika talked about BAFA, LA is now doing the same thing with La Casa, right? So we're starting to also, what I have hope for and what I'm excited for in the future is how do we stitch together all these amazing things happening throughout the state to build a more coordinated kind of statewide system, because there are some phenomenal people now that are in positions of power. And, I think that I feel very privileged to be in a role to help support that and give those folks power, whether that's the resources, connecting them to other folks, whatever it is, so that, like Tamika said, we know a lot of these solutions. It's just about getting that public and political will to enact them that is so critical and important. So I'm incredibly grateful to be with these amazing folks and all of you here today.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again. I'm going to hand it over to Nicole to transition us to the next section.
Yes. Hey, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you to Con for your skillful moderation. We really appreciate it. Melissa, Ruby, Tamika, thank you for being here today. It is always amazing to have a panel of women speaking. And just thank you for the work that you do day in and day out. To engage more deeply with this conversation and topic, please keep an eye out for our calendar of events. We're going to have an extended conversation in late June. We'll be sure to get to some of those questions and comments that we weren't able to address today. And the conference isn't over yet. Join us back at 11:30 on Swapcard for our keynote speaker discussion with Dr. Manuel Pastor from USC and our president and CEO, Dwayne Marsh. If you have any questions about how to get to Swapcard, feel free to stay on and ask me or message me in the chat. And we look forward to seeing you again at future programs. Take care, everyone.